Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your Flip Classroom and our continuing discussion of the lead up to World War II, right? We are all up in it. We are in the thick of it. We're still reading our book. We're getting after it, but let's keep getting after it, right? By the way, G period, great job the other day in class. We were able to move through a bunch of stuff and really get caught up, right? Now, going into it, though, we left off in class talking about the Great Depression, right? We started talking about the Great Depression, the ripple effect from the Dawes Plan, that terrible idea to recycle money throughout the entire world to try and keep the world economies from collapsing, even though they're gonna end up doing that and then a war is gonna happen anyway. But yeah, worth a shot. Now, going into it though, the Great Depression, which lasts from 1930 to 1939, fueled the rise of these totalitarian dictators that we've been talking about, right? Now, just don't get it twisted really quick. All the stuff that we're about to talk about actually took place in the 1920s, and then they're gonna literally solidify their rule during the 1930s, okay? Now, going into it, what I mean by that though, is we're talking about guys like this, right? Particularly your fascist dictators like Hitler and Mussolini, right? These men preyed upon the weakened state of their countries, right? They literally are going to end up rising to their ultimate amounts of power during the early 1930s and then also going into the later 30s, right? For example, Adolf Hitler is going to become the Chancellor of Germany and then eventually becoming the enabled Führer of Germany by 1933, 1934, and then Mussolini took over in 1925, but the extent of his powers actually grew in the 1930s, right? But the question that a lot of us always tend to ask ourselves, that a lot of teachers have probably never told you before, is how did they do this? How did these two evil individuals gain so much steam and popularity that they controlled entire governments, right? Well, a lot of it relates back to that concept of that fractured masculinity, right? Of that idea of restoring their masculinity and giving them back that feeling of being manly and in power, right? Because they took advantage of them when they were at a very weakened state. You gotta remember that, okay? So for our first example, they're going to create these things known as paramilitary groups, right? Now, paramilitary groups are basically fake or pseudo-militaries, right? Now, what I mean by that is they're not official militaries. They're not things sanctioned by the government. You're not drafted into them. They're actually basically recruited from members of bitter men from the First World War, right? Now, for example, you've got like Hitler's brown shirts are going to be a very large one of these groups that they're all actually going to end up for the most part dying later on in this thing called the Night of the Long Knives. But then you also have his black shirts, right? Or his SS, also known as the Schutzstaffel. Now, so the thing about it, though, going into it, okay, that's like his secret police, and also that right there is the leader of the entire thing. That's Heinrich Himmler, right? Now, the SS is like considered to be the worst of the worst. They ran the concentration camps, and also there was a version of them in Italy as well, known as the Italian black shirts, right? Now, these groups roamed the streets, intimidated politicians, and physically assaulted minorities and like communists and anybody that didn't believe in them or believe in their cause, right? So what would end up happening is people like Adolf Hitler and Mussolini would release these groups into the streets and intimidate anybody that would actually go against them, right? So if you were a part of a liberal political party or a communist party or a socialist party or anything like that, these people would literally go and beat them up, right? They wouldn't murder them because they can't do that or else you're going to go to jail, but they would intimidate politicians to not running. They would intimidate people into not voting. They would do a lot of really aggressive tactics, which also included castor oil, right? And castor oil, what that is this stuff that if you drink just a little bit of it, it causes violent regurgitation. And so the thing about it is they would actually force them to drink loads of it, sometimes even leading to people's deaths because of dehydration. Now, as of 1933, when Hitler was commanding the German government, his paramilitary groups became more and more violent, right? And especially his SS as time went on, all right? Now, the other big thing that you got to do, though, is now that you have these fake militaries, is that they're going to end up creating enemies for these militaries to attack. And it's not just going to be like enemy politicians. That's going to grow, and an element of fascism is the absolute obliteration and also persecution of enemy groups, right? Now, or of the opposition in general. So Nazi and Italian fascists are going to turn their paramilitary groups loose to violently attack communists, Jewish people, and other minorities as well. The very first concentration camp would be opened in 1933 during the Great Depression, and it was known as Dachau, right? And the Nuremberg laws were going to be posted in 1935, which were these laws that defined what German Aryans were, quote unquote, right? Now, this is going back to that whole concept that a lot of teachers kind of misunderstood throughout time. He wasn't trying to create blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryans. He actually believed that Germans and true German people were the closest related to this like master race, quote unquote, which is so stupid and is not real and is scientific scientifically false that of these people that were like Nordic, Scandinavian, blonde hair, blue eyed like people that actually originally settled Europe. That's dumb, right? And, and what he's going to do though is in 1935 with the posting of the Nuremberg laws is going to define who Germans are and who everybody else is, right? And he's going to begin to segregate Jewish people away from the German population and refer to them basically along with Jewish people and undesirables, right? Now, Kristallnacht is going to be another really big one, which is this thing known as the Night of Broken Glass, which occurred in 1938, again during the Great Depression. Kristallnacht actually was an event that broke out when a Jewish boy shot and killed an SS officer because the SS officer was bullying his father's Jewish business, right? And the boy that killed him, though, the Nazis are going to come back, and they're not only going to destroy that child, and they're not only going to destroy the business that he represented. I don't know if they killed him or not. I think they did. But they're also going to destroy the entirety of the Jewish neighborhoods in almost every single German city, right? And it's referred to as the Night of Broken Glass because they literally destroyed things, destroyed businesses, destroyed homes, and things like that. Now, this is all a part of that creating the enemy, right? That creating the enemy of trying to turn these disenfranchised, or not even disenfranchised, they're not disenfranchised really at all. They're trying to turn these hyper wounded, emasculated men loose into the streets of Germany to attack these people. Now, what is Hitler's goal? It was this thing known as his Volksgemeinschaft, or the people's community, where he's really literally trying to create a German race that he believes is pure of any flaws or any kind of inadequacies, right? Which is so stupid because he's not going to be able to accomplish that anyway. And then in 1938, you're going to see this pop up as well in Italy with these things known as the Italian racial laws, right? Now, going forward, you're also going to see a heavy reduction in the rights of women, all right? Women are going to have their rights heavily reduced to make them dependent on a man's wages and on a man's earnings, right? And this is another element of restoring their masculinity, right? This, for example, is a magazine that actually came out during the Nazi regime. It's called Frauenwarte, which means women wait. This, of course, is its Italian equivalent, showing, of course, a strapping young boy who is holding a rifle, and then the mother whose only real job seems to be taking care of children, right? So now, going into it as well, though, you need to promise them work, right? Because that's another element that they're lost out on ever since the Great Depression started. Employment in your paramilitary groups or in labor services, right? For example, you've got Italian fascist architecture. This right here is actually a model of fascist architecture. It's a Olympic arena that was actually built in Rome underneath Mussolini's rule. It invokes a lot of old Roman cultural elements. And the other big thing, y'all, is it had to be built. And if it's got to be built, you got to hire people. And so by creating these fascist architecture pieces, you are forcibly creating work. This right here is a part of the Nazi work corps flag, right? Literally take their rifle, give them a gun, right? Here is Hitler actually scooping out one of the big first things of dirt when they started building this thing known as the Autobahn, right? Now, what you have to understand, though, is by promising them work and giving them work, it's going to actually get them to believe in these dictators that are actually truly terrible, evil people, right? Remember, he's taking advantage of them. They are taking advantage of them at their lowest possible state, right? When they were unemployed and they had nowhere else to go, right? Now, another one is, you have to indoctrinate the youth, right? And then you have to actually go after these guys' kids, and you're going to see the creation of Hitler youth organizations and Italian youth organizations, where they would actually begin to literally indoctrinate children from a very young age in the ideals of fascism, Nazism, and Italian fascism as well, right? Now, going into the last but not least, you got a couple other methods, which include propaganda. You've got the people's radio. You've got negative propaganda, holidays and vacations and stuff like that. These are all some smaller methods that are going to help them rise to power, right? Now, propaganda, y'all all know what that is. It's literally this concept of creating advertisements, films, movies, radio shows, things like that can actually lead to the transposition of intense ideas onto people, right? Rosie the Riveter is a piece of propaganda. So is a very, very famous video known as The Triumph of the Will, right? Which actually I don't think even plays anymore because I think they rightfully blocked it on YouTube. Yep. So now, The Triumph of the Will was actually a very, very popular movie that was actually made by Hitler and his media advisor, Joseph Goebbels, that actually shows him descending out of the clouds and landing in Austria, and there's all these smiling faces of people that are ready to see him. And when you play that 100,000 times in Germany, people are going to begin to believe that he's not an evil, terrible, awful person, but he is, right? And so a lot of this is an absolutely like messed up mind game that he's playing with the German people, right? Now the other one though, the People's Radio, a very cheap radio that could actually be bought and purchased and put in every single home, which would actually broadcast Hitler's speeches, right? You have negative propaganda as well, which includes book burnings, right? And book burnings actually would take place in most German cities where they would burn anything that was related or written by a Jewish author, or they would burn anything that actually made Germany look weak, right? And so as we know, our book, All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Remarque, was actually burned at these book burnings as well. Holidays and vacations would actually become a very, very popular thing as well, which actually created even more like allegiance to Nazism and to like the Nazi party under Adolf Hitler, right? So the thing about it that you need to take away from all that is that's how he did it, right? That's how he actually convinced people that he wasn't this evil scumbag when in reality he was a very giant evil scumbag, right? Now Stalin, on the other hand, Joseph Stalin, is going to take a very highly different approach, okay? So this guy that eventually became known as the Man of Steel, because really Joseph Stalin, not his real name. Actually, his real name is Losif Dashgashvili, right? This is him when he was actually a very young man, and he's actually from a place called Georgia. Not Georgia where there are like peaches and stuff, but Georgia, the country in Europe, right? But he would grow up and become what is known as Joseph Stalin, and Stalin actually is a name he took from a newspaper article when someone called him the Man of Steel, right? And so he named himself Joseph, the Man of Steel, right? Now, originally, where he comes from, though, Stalin, the dictator of the USSR, and the premier also of the USSR, was originally a member of Lenin's inner circle, along with this guy named Leon Trotsky. Now, we talked about that guy a little tiny bit when we were talking about the communist revolution in Russia, right? We got Vladimir Lenin right there, you got Joseph Stalin on his right, you got Trotsky on his left, right? Well, the thing about it, though, is what's going to end up happening is Lenin is going to die in 1924, right? Now, when he dies in 1924, there must be an order of succession. Who is going to take over for him as the premier of the Soviet Union, right? Well, the thing about it that you need to understand is that Trotsky and Stalin ended up competing with each other for this role. But what ends up happening is Stalin wins out, right? Stalin ends up winning out in the entirety, and he actually has Trotsky completely banished from the USSR and then exiled as well. And now what ends up happening, though, is Trotsky then later on gets assassinated in Mexico, right? Gets stabbed to death with an ice pick, which is absolutely wild. So like going into it though, don't forget that. Leon Trotsky, jot that down. Leon Trotsky ran out of Russia, Stalin becomes leader, stabbed to death with ice pick. And now, look, going into it, though, he also tried to attack the two massive problems, though, that were occurring in the USSR. So after Lenin died and after Trotsky was ran out, there were two giant issues that were plaguing the USSR. And those two giant issues include unemployment, all right, and low production, and food supply, right? So the problems he tries to address from 1928 to 1939 is a way to try and increase agricultural production and to increase, like, industrial production, right? Now, his plan to do this, all of this stuff, though, okay, write this down, all of this stuff was a part of his 5-year plan, okay? Like, see that right there? 5-year plan? Highlight that for me real quick. Now, his food supply plan was he wanted to try and go true communist and collectivize the means of agricultural production, right? And so what he's going to do by doing that, or what he's going to do in this sense, is he's going to persecute these people known as the kulaks, right? Whereas the Jewish populations were demonized by the Nazis, the kulaks will be demonized by the Russians, right? Now, what this means, though, the word kulak, okay, it is a slang term, or a slur basically, that at the time referred to middle-class farmers predominantly from the Ukraine, right? Now, what kulak means in Russian is actually fist, right? Now, like, when you actually use the word fist, though, in, like, English, you think you're about to hit somebody, right? Well, in Russian, it's used to actually refer to clutching something, right? Literally what he's saying is that these kulaks, like, held on to all the agricultural goods and kept them clutched in their fist, and he thought that they needed to be literally executed. Lenin agreed with this as well, and there are many, many, many quotes of him saying, bring me no more than a dozen kulaks to be executed, right? And so the plan is to kill these people and to starve them out as well. And what would end up happening is he would then take their land and then we would turn them into these collectivized state farms. Now, if he didn't kill them directly, he would oftentimes send them to these places called the gulags, right? And a gulag is a prison labor camp where people would literally be worked to death, right? Turning big rocks into much smaller rocks. Now, going into it, though, this is going to be a massive failure, right? The actual thing that he ends up doing is he actually ends up making the famine worse because collectivization of agriculture takes decades to get done the correct way. And he actually ended up rushing the process too fast and many people are going to die actually due to increased risk of famine. Now, what is this idea, though? What is he going to blame himself? No. So don't blame Stalin, he says. Blame the other Bolsheviks, right? He actually turns on his own party members, and he actually blames them, right? And this thing he goes through is known as the Great Purge, where he literally ends up executing and literally putting on trial many of his inner circle, right? So rather than blaming Stalin blamed guys like these guys that actually flanked them on all of his sides, right? He'd be like, no, it was him, or it was them, or it was their idea to do these things, rather than blaming himself as the totalitarian dictator, right? And as you can see, over time, literally communists would have people scrubbed out of history, right? This still happens to this day. This is Stalin right here with this original image, and notice what happened when it was reissued the next year, missing this individual, which means he was probably sent to the gulags, right? And then it came out the next year, it's missing that other guy with a mustache. He's been scrubbed out of history all the while until it ends up just being Stalin on his own. So not only did kulaks get sent to the gulags, but also so did his Bolshevik inner circle, right? Now, what about the unemployment aspect, okay? Well, his idea there is to hyper-industrialize, right? And the 5-year plan is supposed to really, really focus a lot on industrial output, right? Well, the 5-year plan, okay, that actually focused on the industrial output idea was to build up factories, right? He literally would have cities built around factories. For example, there was one place called Stalingrad that had a tractor plant in it, and they'd literally just build a city around it, right? And then everybody would actually work inside that factory. Did the same thing with Magnitogorsk, which had a steel plant, and the Ural coal mines, right? What ends up happening, though, on this side of the 5-year plan, he built cities around those factories to employ these workers, and production actually increased over 150%. That is why, right there, he was referred to in that article as the man of steel, right? But don't ever blame him for anything, and don't pretend like he didn't make the famine worse, or else you might end up being sent to the gulags, right? Now, so going into it, though, as well, you have to understand that there's one more place we haven't talked about yet, and it's the area of Japan, right? Now, Japan, as many of y'all know, is heavily involved in World War II, right? Now, Japan is going to end up becoming involved in World War II, particularly when they invaded an area known as Manchuria. Now, there's this area in northern China known as Manchuria, which is actually very, very resource dense and has a ton of different items that the Japanese wanted, right? Now, also in retrospect as well, the Russians wanted it too, but that also goes all the way back to the Russo-Japanese War. But going into it, what ends up happening, though, is Japan, without any type of declaration of war or any kind of threat ever issued, they just invaded China, right? Violating a lot of the rules that had been set down by that thing known as the League of Nations after World War I, right? And when they violated these rules, the League of Nations came back at them, and they were like, you must withdraw your forces from China, and you are not allowed to invade them without just cause. This is ridiculous. So Japan just left the League of Nations and then kept invading China during this thing known as the Second Sino-Japanese War. And they were being led by two different individuals, okay? The god Emperor Hirohito, which is actually, of course, a part of their fascist rise to power. And then also this man named the War Minister Hideki Tojo, right? And Hideki Tojo is actually the main leader of Japan during this time period because the Emperor Hirohito is a little bit more behind closed doors and behind the actual scenes, right? But this area in red right here is the areas that they actually directly invaded going into this war, right? So the thing about it is Japan is also having a fascist rise of dictatorships and then also aggressive fascist culture in their own area as well. And they're also beginning to persecute and invade areas of China, which is going to put them on everyone's radar, right? Now, going into it, though, what's going to end up happening is now that all of these fascist leaders have support, okay, now that they're all gaining steam, now that they're all in charge of their respective countries, Germany and Italy are going to begin to push back on the Treaty of Versailles barriers during the Great Depression, right? So something you got to understand is that basically Italy and Germany are going to start trying stuff to see how much they can get away with, and it's going to end up leading to the outbreak of World War II, right? Now, it all starts off with when Italy invaded Ethiopia. Now, why would Italy invade Ethiopia? Ethiopia being a country in East Africa, right? Well, a lot of it goes back to the late 1800s whenever Italy tried to invade Ethiopia during the era of imperialism. But they failed, right? They actually failed to take it over. So coming back in 1935 with Mussolini at the helm and trying to invoke this fascist aggressive culture, he reinvades Ethiopia, and this time they take it over, right? And by trying to grow that empire, that's a huge element of fascism. But this begins to put them on the radar of everyone else because they're beginning to violate a lot of the Treaty of Versailles rules, right? Now, for example, speaking of the Treaty of Versailles, no one violated it quite like Hitler violated it, right? The Treaty of Versailles says that Germany can have an army of no more than 100,000 men. that the draft is banned, that they're not allowed to have an air force, and they're not allowed to have any submarines. And they must have an insanely small navy. Well, Hitler in 1935, when he comes to power, is going to bring back the draft and make an army of 500,000 soldiers. 13 million total, by the way, would serve in World War II. He's going to create a German air force called the Luftwaffe, and he's going to build up the navy. But why, really quickly, would he do this? He's violating the rules of the treaty that actually say specifically that he's not allowed to do this, right? Well, then, okay, if you violate a treaty, what are the Allies supposed to do? They're supposed to step in, they're supposed to stop him, and they're supposed to make sure that this doesn't break out into a war ever again. Well, check this out, y'all. The Allies, including Britain, France, and America, did nothing. He violated these massive rules of the Treaty of Versailles, and the Allies did nothing, right? They did absolutely nothing. They just let him do it, right? And then in 1936, the Treaty of Versailles said that this area, known as the Rhineland in western Germany, must stay what is known as a demilitarized zone, right? It is not allowed to have any military inside of it. Well, what's going to end up happening, though, is he's going to remilitarize the Rhineland, right? That right there is known as the Rhineland, and it's not allowed to have any German military in it whatsoever. And he remilitarizes it. He puts a massive military there, right? And what do the Allies do? Nothing. They do nothing at all. And in 1938, the Treaty of Versailles says that Germany must respect Austria as a country and leave them alone. But in an event known as the Anschluss, by the way, Anschluss is spelled A-N-S-C-H-L-U-S-S, the Anschluss, Hitler annexes Austria and takes it over, right? Now, we will talk about this a little bit more in class, and we'll talk about the very first shots of World War II being fired in class when he invades Poland in 1939. But I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.